I would say in the interest of time, we can probably get started, and as people trickle in, that's okay. Just a couple of just a couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over to Dave and Jen. We have the Q&A box that you can use for questions during the presentations. We'll do a little bit of Q&A at the end of our panel session. And if you have any other issues, feel free to message us through the chat. So
am I going to show, do I show up to you people on the screen? Because I'm not in the box there.
I don't know if your camera's having issues. It doesn't, we can just, it looks like you turned your camera on, but we cannot see you.
So it's okay then, the way it is?
Yeah.
You're saying?
Let's just roll with it. So,
no, I just can't. It's odd to me, that's all. So, all right.
Might just be a small technical difficulty.
All set?
All set.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the SRPC webinar, Pipelines for Funding Local Projects. You'll recall this is in lieu of the fiscal year 2021 annual meeting. And today's date is the 24th, and the time right now is 4:03 p.m. We reformatted this because of COVID-19 in place of the traditional meeting. We did already have on the 18th of June our regular business meeting. One of the items on that meeting had to do with officers for the commission, and the reason I'm speaking to you rather than Victoria Parmalee is because I'm the new chair. Enormously big shoes to fill. I think we can, I will try. I think we can all commend Victoria for an enormous amount of personal commitment over so many years. And she served as chair since 2016, I believe. And we look forward to more contributions from Victoria, and everybody thinks the world of her. She's amazing. So launching into our day today, we do have a panel presentation. We have three esteemed panelists with us today. And I'll just tell you the first three names, and then we'll learn more about them and why they're specifically speaking with us today. Alan Brigham is the Economic Development Representative at the United States Economic Development Administration. Yeah, he's serving in a federal role. And Katy Easterly Martey is the Executive Director of Community Development Finance Authority at the state of New Hampshire, obviously the state role. Christopher Parker is here. He's the Assistant City Manager, Director of Planning and Strategic Initiatives, City of Dover, and he's with us here today. And the basic point here behind this webinar is they're going to be discussing advancing local projects and preparing for post-COVID communities. Yay, post-COVID. Like to say that a couple of times. I think we all do. It's been one heck of a year. I think one of the things we can say about SRPC is with all the challenges, it appears to everyone, I think, that the transition in and out of COVID-19 is seamless. And it may not have felt seamless to everybody, but it looks that way. And so a lot of pats on the back there from all the folks that work at SRPC and the leadership involved. We saw an awful lot of disruption in this country over the past year, and we didn't see it at SRPC. Very impressive. In fact, they've even increased their involvement in our 18-member community. So moving on. So the panelists are going to talk about pipelines for funding local projects, including how to develop community project concepts, integrate them into local CIPs, and best position yourself to take advantage of expected and unexpected funding sources. So I think with that, I will, if Alan Alan Brigham is the first speaker. I'll turn it over to Alan.
Thank you. As I was introduced, my name is Alan Brigham. I am the Economic Development Representative for New Hampshire and Maine. I work out of my home outside of Portland, Maine, and I've been doing this for 13 and a half years at this point. And before that, I spent almost 2 decades working in economic development at the state level. So the question here is, what lens does the EDA typically use when looking at a project that is being considered for funding? And it's a fairly simple lens, really. The EDA is one of roughly 300 different federal agencies and sub-agencies, and we are the only one that is focused exclusively on economic development. And the lens that we look at projects through is principally around job creation, job retention, and private investment that is facilitated, meaning investment that ends up on the tax rolls, or projects that are catalysts for those types of things. We work, you'll hear later on as we talk, that we tend to work collaboratively with our clients. We're a very small agency. For my entire time here, we've had roughly anywhere from 150 to maybe 175 employees. But with CARES Act funding, I think we're now well over 250. So we're growing. Our region is part of the Philadelphia Regional Office, which covers Virginia and Washington, D.C., all the way up to Maine, plus Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, roughly 25% of the U.S. economy and population. We are created, our mission is to provide support for economic development projects in distressed communities, distressed regions. So we do have a distress element to how we consider projects. So I think my task right now is to give you a very brief overview of the major programs that we have. And I do apologize, my computer is not working properly, and I have neither a microphone nor a camera that works. So I'm voice only through my phone. EDA has 4 principal programs that we use in supporting economic development at the local and regional level. The first is traditionally our bread and butter. It's the Public Works program, and it was really what we were created to do, was to invest in public works that provide foundations for economic growth. Public works in our region, typically our funding for that is maybe 30 million, maybe slightly less. So it can get spread pretty thin. It's for construction projects only, and no personnel or any other types of expenses. And we've actually invested in a number of projects in New Hampshire in public works in recent years. But that program has been somewhat overwhelmed recently by our Economic Adjustment Assistance Program, and it's our most flexible program. We can use it for anything that the EDA is authorized to do, both construction, non-construction, and combinations of the two. That's also the program that our CARES Act funding is placed into, that if we receive any disaster recovery supplemental funding, that is placed in that program also. And also our ARPA funding has been placed into that program as well. And I've got to digress for a second and talk about ARPA. We are getting lots of inquiries about the American Recovery Plan Act. The EDA received $3 billion in ARPA funds. And what we don't have yet is the guidance on how to spend that money. That's reflected in something called a Notice of Funding Opportunity, known as a NOFO. And my understanding is that there will be several of those published for that $3 billion. And we're waiting anxiously to see that documentation so that we can answer our clients' questions and figure out how we're going to use that money. Those two programs, Public Works and Economic Adjustment, both require an economic distress eligibility component, meaning that the location of the project has to meet the EDA's economic distress criteria. And that's principally measured by unemployment rates or per capita income, or a long list of what we call special needs. We also have the ability to invest in areas that are non-distressed as long as they're in an EDA designated economic development district. And I'm happy to say that SRPC is an EDA designated economic development district, so that provides a little bit of flexibility. I don't want to run over my time here, so that the next two smaller programs that we have that can be of interest to communities are planning and local technical assistance. I describe planning, well, first of all, we have two planning programs. One is called partnership planning, which we use to fund our designated economic development districts every year. So SRPC does receive funding through that program. But then we have short-term planning that we can use to assist a community or an organization in trying to figure out the path that it needs to take to get to a certain objective. And we use this money for, say, countywide strategic plans, community strategic plans, things like that. And then the final program is called Local Technical Assistance. And I describe that as being a program that is used to fill a knowledge gap. So feasibility studies, market analyses, market studies, things of that nature where the community or the organization needs data in order to make a decision as to how to proceed or whether or not to proceed at all. So those are the four principal programs that we have. I'll go back to ARPA and Economic Adjustment Assistance for just a second. I would encourage anybody that's interested in EDA programs to go to our website at eda.gov. And the first thing that will pop up will be a little window that allows you to sign up for email alerts. And if you do that, when the funding opportunities for any of our programs are published, you'll get a notification and you can go access that particular document. So that's a very, very shallow and brief overview of the four principal programs that the EDA uses at the local and regional level. And so I will turn it back over. And of course, we'll have plenty of time, I think, for questions and further discussion.
Yeah, so I think next up, we were thinking, Katie, would you be able to talk a little bit about Cdfa and the work that you all do?
Absolutely, thank you. So I'm Katy Easterly Martey with the Community Development Finance Authority. And as was stated, we are a statewide entity. So we're a statewide community and economic development entity, and we serve all of New Hampshire. We're state chartered, independent, and a nonprofit. And we're similar to other state authorities like the Business Finance Authority or New Hampshire Housing. So we administer a number of programs, which I'm happy to be able to give you an overview of today. And those funds provide an ecosystem of funding that support community and economic development projects. We look to advance those community and economic development projects as well as clean energy projects, as I said, all over New Hampshire. And they take on a really different kind of structure depending on the community, and they do be responsive to the needs in the community. But there are some that really, there are certain connections that they each have, including really meeting community needs, having a community benefit, and a public purpose. So those are the sort of the tethers that anchor them all. We really see New Hampshire having communities that are economically and socially resilient and respect their natural surroundings, and there are places where people live, work, and play, want to do those things, just like you all do. And in our mission, we invest in New Hampshire by having grants, loans, and tax credit equity. And we try to be flexible and innovative in the deployment of those resources. And similar to the EDA, they're across a spectrum of different areas. And those areas include concept initiation, so really supporting a group of individuals, a nonprofit, a municipality, hopefully actually individuals working with nonprofits and the municipality. Those we see really as the strongest partners to advance a project. And in concept initiation, This is where we're providing capacity building support, similar to what Alan recommended, to build the partnerships that will successfully carry out this project. Secondly, we have funds in the area of planning and development. And in this area, it's where we're providing funding, much of which goes through a municipality and which can be applied for with the help of a regional planning commission for the advancement of planning for a particular project. So often that's to advance a site plan, architectural and engineering studies, a market study, if that's necessary, a funding plan. So how you're really going to stack those various funding resources, hopefully including, if appropriate, EDA, as well as the resources at CDFA to be able to construct your project. The vast majority, the thing that CDFA is known for is those physical community and economic development infrastructure projects, things like water and sewer, childcare facilities, affordable housing, either the creation of new housing or the rehabilitation of existing housing. But we also do provide support for other community and economic development projects, for instance, workforce development projects. There was a partnership in one community between the technical school and a pipeline of workforce opportunity to create some workforce opportunities in aviation. And the funds that we provided actually allowed the technical school to purchase the parts of a plane so that they could work to assemble a plane that they then sold and bought parts to another plane. And so sometimes our funding doesn't support a physical infrastructure, a childcare center, a daycare center, a housing, water and sewer, but it facilitates economic development. So there's those types of projects as well. The programs in our main area, so in implementation, that we have the majority of our funds are the community development block grants. So this is $9 million a year that's distributed across New Hampshire. Municipalities apply for the funds. Typically, it's not municipalities who get their own allocation of the community development block grant. So in your region, that's Dover and Rochester and Portsmouth, but it's all the other communities that are considered part of the balance of state, so that you would be applying for those resources as a municipality with the support of the Regional Planning Commission to be able to implement those resources into a project like a public facility, a housing project, or an economic development project. It's up to $500,000 of grant funds to support those projects. Secondly, we have the tax credit program, and that's up to $5 million. It's basically the state committing its business profit and business enterprise tax to nonprofits who want to carry out public purpose projects. So the nonprofits apply for an allocation of the tax credits, and then they actually seek the donations from businesses to support their project. And in exchange, the business gets a 75% tax credit on their business profit or business enterprise tax. The way we like to talk about it is that the business, instead of putting their funds into the general state, they can put their funds directly into a project in their community that they're excited about. And finally, the Clean Energy Fund. We have funds to support municipal, nonprofit, and business improvements in the areas of renewables and energy efficiency, and also can facilitate the investment of other clean energy technology. We actually supported a really unique project in which the county bought a piece of equipment that would reduce their emissions. They received T-Rex, which is a certain credit that's exchanged for the less emissions of the less of emissions. And so we were able to help finance actually the purchase of that piece of equipment. And then the repayment of the loan that we provided is coming from those T-Rex. So we're often able to finance kind of unique financial structures that allow municipalities, nonprofits, and in unique circumstances, businesses to accomplish their community and economic development goals. So I think I'll stop there for now and turn it over to the third panelist.
Great, thanks, Katie. So Chris, we have you on here to speak with a slightly different perspective, since the city of Dover, at least last I heard, is not offering grants to everybody else in our region for projects. So can you talk a little bit about the capital improvements process that you've set up in Dover, and how you work projects through that CIP and plan for implementation of infrastructure projects or other projects on behalf of the city?
Absolutely. And before I do that, I would note that should we ever win Powerball, we might be interested in becoming a funding agency. Unfortunately, we're probably not eligible for Powerball, so sorry to the rest of you. To James' point, certainly we are on the flip side of what the EDA and CDFA are doing. We are looking, just as many of the viewers here today are, at ways to provide project stability and project creation so that when those funding elements are available, we have them in the pipeline or the queue to apply for. We utilize a capital improvements program process, which I'm sure most of the communities here today represented do. We start in July, so we're actually underway right now, or just about underway, with project solicitation amongst the various offices and service delivery areas here in the city, including the school side, where we put together project solicitation forms where we look for projects that are going to improve the efficiency of delivery of service, protect the infrastructure that's already been invested in here in the community, or create new infrastructure to help promote the health, safety, and welfare of the community. That process, that capital improvements program process, takes our community about 4 to 5 months. Once we actually hit the meat of it, which is usually mid-August, in September, October, we present to the City Council and the Planning Board the recommendations of the projects to include in that 6-year plan by the city manager. The Planning Board and then the City Council each do their own independent review of those projects. And ultimately, it's the City Council which would vote to authorize the capital improvements programming elements themselves. What we do here, and I say it's a 6-year project program, but it's really not, in the sense that we have about a 10-year lookout of projects we want. Those projects tend to stem from our master plan, whether it's our transportation chapter or our community facilities and utilities chapter, or any of the other chapters we have where there might be capital investment recommended. We really look at the CIP as the way to connect our physical needs, that infrastructure need, with our fiscal requirements. It is not a funding document, but it certainly helps us understand where the infrastructure needs are and identifies what funding sources might be available and how we might then have a plan in place to utilize them. So working with the staff, we put together a program that the City Council and the Planning Board have reviewed and then put forward. And every year, hopefully, projects matriculate from year 6 to year 1. And then in year 1, we're ready to go. One thing that we do here in Dover that is a little bit different than other communities, I think, is that when a project is proposed, we separate the design and engineering phase from the construction phase. So maybe in year 6 this year, we would have the design and engineering phase of a road replacement project or a water sewer utility replacement improvement project. And then 2 years from now, in year 6, would be the construction element of that, so that we are able to get the funding for design earlier and then come back and refine the construction values so that they're a little bit more solid. Obviously, in the past couple of years, those numbers have not been solid when you see the construction costs that we've all experienced. What we also do that I think is a little bit different is when we ask the council to approve the authorization of the capital improvements program with that year 1 design engineering money in it, we also have them do the full project. So they might be seeing just for a round number's sake, a $200,000 expense for design of a roadway project in that 2-year out span, there would be maybe the $4 million needed to actually build that project. We would be asking them to approve the full $4.2 million project so that if we get design done early, we can then move towards that construction. Or as we found, and I think this is the relevant part for today's conversation, when we have applied for federal or state funding, they're going to be looking for that local match, that local commitment. And it's not just the design commitment, but if the EDA or CDFA was willing to fund all or a portion of a project, they're going to want to see that you're actually shovel ready, you're ready to go. So we found that the best way to do that is to have the council, in our case, the local legislative body, approve the authorization to move forward with the construction phase. We don't want to just design things and then have them languish. We want to be able to design and then construct. So from the commitment standpoint, we want to be able to show potential funders that we have the wherewithal of local support for them.
That's a really interesting concept because it sort of helps connect those two parts in the pipeline, but still sets them up as sort of distinct stages to make sure that you're sort of proceeding in an organized fashion. So I think that sort of leads us and tees up our next question. When we were putting this panel together, we were really thinking about how do you take a project from just being an idea or from early conception all the way through to construction. And that can come with a lot of different phases, whether it's the planning, the feasibility studies, the engineering and construction, Chris, that you were talking about. So can each of you touch a little bit on which of those phases that your organizations may be most involved with? And then can you also talk about how you pull together a project team that is going to be able and have the capacity to take this project from just being an idea all the way through to seeing it actually constructed and in the ground? Alan, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, James. So as I understand, my task here is to talk about how we establish a project team and what phases of project development does the EDA get involved with. Well, I would say the answer to the second question is pretty much all of them, but it really depends upon the client. Obviously, an economic development project, we'll just say it's a construction project, has to start with a vision. And that vision is generally something that specifically will address either a need or an opportunity or both. And out of that vision, a champion has to emerge, someone that will drive the project forward, will take a leadership role in it, and will typically ensure that it stays on track. And that champion may not be the individual that is actually working on assembling the application package and trying to scope the project, but it will be someone who actually drives it. And typically at that stage, once the organization, the community has identified the need and or the opportunity, when it's an EDA type project, they'll reach out to me and have a discussion regarding whether or not it will get traction with the EDA, how the EDA might react to it, what some of the parameters that it would have to fit into. And based upon those initial discussions, and let me digress for a second. I will say that the EDA process, and you'll hear more about this, is very collaborative. We work in partnership with applicants because ultimately, when an application is finally submitted, it's presented to a funding committee, what we call the investment review committee, who will actually look at the project subjectively and will vote on whether it should be funded or not. And if it's a Maine or New Hampshire project, I'm the one that makes that presentation. So we become partners because I become the project advocate and presenter to the EDA. So anyway, back to the sequence. Once those initial discussions are held, the the applicant, the champion for the project, will generally start to assemble their project team. And that's not something that the EDA gets involved in. But that team, as I'm sure Chris could articulate more about, really depends upon what the unique characteristics of the project are. But if it's construction, it will require engineering and public works involvement. And it needs involvement from people from the financial side of things, and perhaps even the legal side, and certainly the planning and administrative side. The applicant needs to consider what types of authority and political leadership are required for the project, and who is going to coordinate the application assembly process, because we're talking federal government here, and that automatically includes a certain level of bureaucracy and a pretty voluminous amount of paperwork. So somebody has to actually keep track of all of that. Then what are the match requirements? Where is the match going to come from? And how is it, and how available is it? So the project team, the champion, needs to reach out to find sources of the local share. EDA's standard grant rate is 50%. So, a regular project for us has a 1-to-1 match requirement. That can change depending upon the program and the need and the amount of economic distress, but the match has to be available and committed to the project at the time of the application. So it's also important that at that fairly early stage of the project development and team development process, that the applicant needs to really understand the rules. And that requires reading the Notice of Funding Opportunity, because that has all the gory detail of how the program works, what is required of the applicant, how the application is going to be reviewed, and the award made. So understanding and reading the NOFO is important. I generally recommend next that the applicants draft a scope of work and a budget as kind of a working document, because that's the core of the application. And the rest of the application is all about who you are, where you are, why you need the funding, and what the expected economic impacts of it are. The core is the scope and the budget. And once everyone is comfortable with what that looks like, then the rest of it is much more, say, research and administrative in nature. Next in this process is, and this is involved in developing the scope, an engineer or qualified person or firm needs to be involved, because every construction project requires something called a preliminary engineering report. And it's a templated document that answers a series of questions and provides a detailed cost estimate for the project itself. And our engineers will review that after the application is submitted to make an assessment of its feasibility and reasonableness. The engineer or other professional firm or individual also has to prepare what we call an environmental narrative, which is a very similar document, but as the engineering report, but it does deal with environmental issues. And once those are underway, then it becomes a matter of assembling the application package, which is a whole host of different documents, certifications, and so forth, but also all of that narrative about, again, who you are, where you are, why you need the project, and what do you think will be the expected impacts from it. So as that project goes along, I usually will have several meetings with the client, and we'll review where the project is. We'll review any documentation that's been assembled, et cetera, and to make sure that it is meeting EDA's requirements, because ultimately, as I noted, I present the project to our investment review committee, and I'd like to be able to present projects that are complete and that are competitive and that present well. And again, a subjective review means that the simpler and more impactful it is, the better. But again, a collaborative process where we work together as partners. Once the final thing is, once a construction project is awarded, then I'm out of it. The EDR backs away and the project is handed off to our engineering staff, who then take over the administration of the project all the way through to its completion and closeout. That's it.
Great, thanks, Alan. Katie, what about you? Can you talk about, if people have ideas for a CDBG project or a tax credit project, when do they involve CDFA? How are you involved in that project team development process, all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we see many different project teams come into CDFA for funding, but there's a couple of components that I'd say usually make the most successful and competitive projects. And some of the items are really things that Alan spoke to as well. I really see these as three things. Not all projects have all three. Sometimes they have very strong two of them, or even strong one of them, and they still are successful at seeking funding from CDFA. But the three are having a community plan, having the project that you're proposing fit within a community vision or plan, having it be consistent, and having there be buy-in from a broader group. We do not have a required match in either our tax credit program or our CDBG program. So there are times in which the CDBG or the tax credit funds are the majority of funds for the project, but that's not typical. Typically, there are other funds that are part of the funding mix. So really having that community behind your project allows you just to have, a lot of good talent and ideas and other funding invested into your project. Secondly, Alan mentioned this, and we see this as essential, and that's really to have a project catalyst, someone that's really thinking through all the parts that need to be aligned in order to make it successful, and really leading and driving that project to that finish line and that completion. Thirdly, it's really great to have institutional support behind the project. We often see, particularly for CDBG, that having that kind of institutional support really allows the project to be successful in the long run. A couple of main players from our perspective are a project manager and a project administrator. So the way that the community development block grants work is a competitive application. That's actually how all of our funds work, except for our clean energy loan funds. They're competitive applications on either, and we accept applications either once or twice a year. We work hand in hand with that project catalyst, that applicant till they apply. And once they apply, then it's a competitive process. So at that point, we're evaluating the projects in the round, ranking them according to the scoring criteria, and then providing funding for the projects that are scored highest. In any given year, like last year, we funded with $16.9 million, 109 different projects. So you can see we fund a lot of projects. And I'd say the majority of projects that come into us, if we don't fund them in any given one round, because they don't score high enough to receive funding, they likely become it's likely because they're not ready. They don't have all the readiness elements to score as high as they could in that readiness area. And they work on their readiness and they apply again, and we likely fund them in a subsequent round. Particularly, again, if they have that, if they're part of a community plan, they're really a project that meets a need. So that project manager will see the project through construction. We don't have, there are some construction requirements, but really we let that be led by the needs of the project. And that project manager will oversee the architect, the construction team, and ensure that the project stays on time and is completed successfully. And then we also, particularly for the federal funding, so the community development block grants, we suggest a project administrator. And that administrator, which is often the RPC, is able to help the project meet those federal requirements, be sure they're submitting those reports and meeting those compliance objectives. We're lucky that our RPC partners come to trainings on a regular basis and are really up to date on all those requirements. And it takes a lot of that, the mystery and the confusion out of compliance, and allows for the project to be advanced according to the needs of that project, and hopefully lessens the burden of the federal compliance for the project itself. So those are the two roles that we see are really essential, is a project manager, keeping that project, really managing the architects, the engineers, and the contractors, and then a project administrator to help through those complex federal requirements. But again, we fund more than 100 projects a year, so you can imagine those are from small community-based, just sort of projects that are an initial phase of a community economic development strategy, and then we fund very complex infrastructure heavy projects that have lots of funding sources brought together, significant expense and planning in terms of engineering and other pre-development activities. So it's really the gamut of complexity in terms of the projects we're reviewing, and we look for our resources to be accessible to applicants regardless of the complexity of the project, really looking to fund those small community-based projects as well as those large complex community infrastructure projects.
Great. So Chris, you're next up. And again, I think I want to turn this question a little bit on its head for you. So still thinking about, how do you establish your project team? Who are you bringing into a project? But then thinking about sort of a pipeline to external funding sources, what do you feel that you have to have accomplished and pulled together for a project before you feel like you're ready to look outside and find some other sources of funding you might be able to leverage?
So I think what I mentioned earlier, that we develop our capital improvements program, which is a 6-year program, but we develop it based on a list of 10-year outlook for projects. We also look at it from the reverse 10 years in the sense of when we provide a project at completion, what does it look like? How did we get there? We try to reverse engineer and think, what will make this successful? What obstacles might we run into? And put together a project team that can make sure we can get to success. So that project team is going to involve a project champion, which may be the department head, maybe myself. It's going to involve the actual day-to-day program manager, the person that is going to be working towards the oversight of the actual project development. But it's also going to involve potentially a steering committee, a public-based or internal committee, maybe including the stakeholder groups that are represented that will provide the success for the project delivery. And so by that, I mean, we look at, if we're an outside funding source, what reporting are we going to need to be having in mind? What end result reports, monitoring, evaluations are going to be needed? And how can we get those people in those positions and stakeholders on board early so that everyone knows what their role is and everyone understands what they're committing to get this project to be successful? There's no point in putting together a project that can't be successful. So we want to have a positive project delivery from the very inception. So one of the things we do there is identify through our master plan, through our other feasibility studies, other connection points, what is needed to make that project the best project it can be, so that when we are putting our best foot forward in applying for grants, applying for outside funding, we try to put ourselves in the role of what are Alan and Katy looking at when they're evaluating, or their teams are evaluating applications. And so we try to build the local policymaker buy-in. We try to build the local community support, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, whether it's the Main Street group, whether it's a local bike rider group, that if we're doing a project looking for funding for assistance with bike lanes or similar, how do we get those local groups on board so that when we apply to Katy and Alan, that we're really providing a shot for success? Because I think that everyone from the community involved to the funding agency wants to be able to have their project be the showcase project for the next round of, look at all that we can accomplish, look at why this funding was valuable, particularly in a situation like we have right now with funding that's become available through earmarks or through the ARPA programs. Those programs are successful and they're deemed successful when they actually accomplish something. And when they show the funding agencies, the ultimate backers, whether it be the US Congress or the General Court here in the state of New Hampshire, that the money actually improved and accomplished something. It wasn't just used to fund a want, but there was a need identified, and the metrics behind it were shown to have been successful. So that, I'd say, is the last part that we try to put together, is determining metrics. What will define the success, and how are we going to then monitor and successfully show that there's been success accomplished? And so looking at it from the end point is how we get there. I think we really strive to say to ourselves, in 10 years, what do we define as this project's been successful? How do we want that to look?
Great. So I have one more sort of pre-planned question for the panel, but I just want to note that we did get our first question on the Q&A function. So all of those of you who are watching, please submit your questions so that we can follow up in a couple minutes during the Q&A portion. So for the last question that I have for the three of you, I want to think about what are some of the more common barriers that you see to completing some of these projects or acquiring funding for these projects? And are there traits that you have seen common in successful projects to overcome them? And Chris, you had just talked a little bit about being ready for when that project is funded and the administrative stuff on the back end. So I think I'm going to ask you to pick this one up first and start there.
So I think the common traits or common barriers that we might see to completing project is a realistic expectation of what the project can accomplish and the funding might need to be for that project. No one likes, whether at a local level, state level, or federal level, to assume something's going to cost $850,000 only to find it costs $2.8 million. No one likes that oops ask later on. There's obviously a barrier right now is the cost of construction, and the cost of financing is positive, but also the availability of financing is certainly limited. So one of the things we try to anticipate is inflationary cost going up. When we create a project now thinking it'll be designed in 5 years and then constructed in 7 years, we have to include a potential inflationary factor, and it's harder to do these days. But I think that's probably the biggest obstacle or barrier we need to keep in mind, is that cost of construction never goes down. But also that institutional knowledge, we need to make sure that the project manager, for the ability we have, the project manager that proposes it or we identify that might be the champion today, is still going to be here in 7 years, or still be able to have the capacity to run this project and make it successful. So we have to think about contingency planning around that. We have to think about how to keep everyone in the loop so that if someone needs to step in, we had a great project here where I was the champion. The project manager ended up being out on maternity leave, so I had to be able to step in. So those things happen, and you have to be able to have the internal capacity to move forward with those projects on a moment's notice, but also have the community backing, the legislative body or the appropriate advisory committee supporting you as well, so that we have flexibility to make changes, move forward, and get a project complete.
Katie, why don't we work our way back up with this one then? So what are some of the more common barriers or I guess reasons that you have had to say no to projects? And how do you see people sort of addressing those and overcoming them?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we've really seen is that those areas and either the populations being served or the communities themselves that have the most need for community economic development resources to advance projects in their community, they often have the least capacity to really strategically plan for those projects and bring in an application. And so we really had to think creatively about how to fund partnerships so that organizations, either municipal organizations, administrators, or nonprofits with capacity can partner with others that maybe really have a need, but not a lot of capacity to advance the project and put in an application. What we see is those organizations with more resources have an ability to really think forward to what they might need in terms of a building expansion. So they've seen a steady increase in the children they serve in their childcare center, and they really can see that means that they're going to need an expansion in 5 years. And then so they start that planning in terms of, is there an appropriate piece of land to expand their facility? Do they need a second facility? They plan that early, and they're able then to put together resources in terms of capital to complement the capital they applied to us for. But unfortunately, sometimes in that example, the childcare facility that's serving the children with the most needs, the families with the lowest income, they often don't have as much administrative capacity. So they're not having that ability to really plan ahead for that expansion. It's more, they're coming to us when they have a significant, sometimes, not always, but we've seen that they come to us when they have like a imminent breakdown of their facility. And so we're really looking to help build capacity in those organizations and in municipalities that may not have a lot of staff capacity, but really have a need for an investment of capital to advance, some improvements to their downtown or a great project in their community. We see that in our rural communities where they're working on, particularly in the last year and a half, some really immediate issues, and it doesn't allow them to individually think through what their future plans would be. So we've been actually really pleased to be able to partner with the RPCs and really think about using planning studies to help communities to sort of plan for future needs, particularly communities that don't have the ability to do some of that capital project planning without those community development block grant resources. So I think capacity, that's the one we see as the most significant challenge, and sometimes readiness as well. But usually readiness can be sort of works through over time with some resources and guidance.
And Alan, same question to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you for creating another category of questions, because the question was what were barriers to the success, and then you also added what are some of the reasons for no, and they're a little bit different in some cases. So some of the barriers for, say, successful project development are, and this has been mentioned previously, not having a project champion who can drive it forward to the finish line, keep it on track. Not having clearly identified and confirmed match, a lack of capacity. We sometimes work with communities where everybody that's involved in a project is a volunteer. They don't have staff. Communities that have staff that are at least partially dedicated to economic development do much better because they can focus on these things. But if it's all volunteers and they have no experience in working with the federal government and working within the bureaucracy, then it really is a problem. Not having a plan for paying expenses when the project is awarded. The EDA makes awards on a reimbursement basis, and the applicant or the recipient has to pay the bills beforehand. So there usually needs to be some sort of a financing mechanism in place. Not understanding the rules, and the rules are very complex. So, for example, and this is just one of them, if a community hires an engineering firm to prepare that preliminary engineering report, that's a required part of an application, that engineering firm is prohibited from actually bidding on the engineering work for the project itself. And that catches a lot of people by surprise. So things like that have to be identified up front. And then another issue is when a project comes in and it looks like there's the appearance of or the actual passing through of federal money to a private business. that's obviously prohibited. And so if it looks like that, it's probably not going to get a lot of traction. And then, as Chris mentioned a couple of minutes ago, right now we're dealing with construction costs that are just climbing astronomically. And virtually every construction project that we deal with ends up having budget problems, because usually construction doesn't start for several months or even a couple of years after the award, depending upon the project. To James' new category of reasons that we say no. Remember, the EDA evaluates projects on a subjective basis, no scoring, no formulas, none of that. So it has to, the project has to present competitively. So if there is unclear or uncertain matching funds, that would be grounds for a no. If the project is too complex, that the members of the review committee can't wrap their heads around it, that can result in a no. And we've had projects where they have different organizations embedded within each other to try to maximize the use of, say, historic tax credits and new market tax credits and things like that. And if it's just too complex, it loses traction. Also, another reason for no is that the identified need and or the identified expected economic impact are unclear or not substantiated. And then we're now starting to pay a lot more attention to support from the project's beneficiaries. If it's an infrastructure project, who benefits from it? And are they willing to come forward and express support for it? If they don't, then that impairs traction. And so, James, am I supposed to talk about some of the traits of successful projects, or is that next?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you keep hearing me talk about champions. So successful projects, pretty much always have a solid champion who will drive it forward. They do have the capacity to bring in the right people and apply the right expertise and coordinate all of those moving parts in putting the application together. Their matching funds are solid, confirmed, easily quantified and understood, and the scope of work is easily understood, as well as the organizational structure. And then, of course, the project needs to have strong local and regional support from both the beneficiary businesses and even politically, from the community. Those are kind of some of the key elements of a successful project.
Great. So we do have a few questions for the audience. Again, if anybody else thinks of any more, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. One that was specifically for Alan, but I'm going to open it up to both of you. The vast majority of smaller communities in New Hampshire, and possibly in other places in New England, may need a vote at town meeting to improve municipal budgets, or to authorize an allocation of funds for a specific project. And frequently that includes match for a large infrastructure project. So I guess from a timing perspective, how have you been able to work with towns to align with that calendar? And then from a sort of logistics of securing that match physically for the project, have you been able to provide any flexibility or support that would help keep projects alive in that environment?
That's a kind of a tricky question, and it's one that I have encountered on several occasions here at the EDA. Maine is a town meeting state as well, so we have the project that process in both states. The EDA, by regulation, requires that the matching funds be, and this is a quote, available, committed to the project, and not otherwise encumbered at the time of the application. So when the EDA approves a project and obligates EDA funds, we have to know for sure that the required matching funds are also in place and committed to the project so that it can proceed. So when it comes to a town meeting situation, in some cases, in anticipation of the EDA application, the town meeting will approve, say, a bond authorization that is dedicated solely to the EDA project and only should the EDA project be approved. A bond authorization will generally carry the day under those circumstances. Some communities are willing to call special town meetings to deal with these kinds of issues. In fact, we had one up in northern New Hampshire that had to have a couple of special town meetings to deal with the match issue. And so there are usually ways to deal with it, but again, the matching funds do have to be confirmed and committed to the project, if not actually in hand. Again, a bond authorization or a loan commitment from a bank or something like that would work. So you don't actually have to have the cash in the bank. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does a little bit. And you've talked about your process being a little bit different in terms of your scoring, and it's subjective, and you need people to champion that project really on both ends, on the local end, and then you taking things to your superiors to advocate for the funding. Do you have the ability to sort of hold things at a certain point in that process, pending getting that match in place? Or do you have a cycle where if the match isn't here by this date, you're sort of back to square one and you need to start again?
I can think of only one instance where we issued an award with a special condition on it that required the applicant to confirm within, I think, 30 days that they had the matching funds in hand. And if they could not do that, then we would terminate the award for convenience. And that particular instance was a state entity that a quasi-state entity that the board of directors had to vote on a substantial amount of match. And we knew that they were going to meet within 2 weeks. And so we proceeded that way. But generally, we would not approve an award at our level and then hold it pending approval, say, of a town meeting. But that's kind of, the nature of the EDA is that we can kind of try to figure these things out. So if there's a community that wants to pursue EDA funding, and town meeting budgetary process is going to be a factor, then we should talk about it and try to figure out what some of the possibilities are. Every project is unique in both the project structure itself, but in how it's funded. So and we are usually able to work with those within those various factors.
Great. Katie, what about you? Experiences with town meeting and budgets?
Yeah, so for the tax credit program, there's not a particular requirement for other resources being committed. So we've seen various levels of readiness, and we are looking for different readiness based on our knowledge of what really makes sense for that project. So actually, in terms of an investment of tax credits into affordable housing projects, we're sometimes the very first resource in the door, recognizing that the project will need to seek business donors to support that project and still finalize through their planning and zoning approvals. So in that area, in the tax credit area, if there's strong community support and a real public purpose and benefit, those are our most significant thresholds for the project, then sometimes the readiness is a little bit longer coming for the tax credit program. On the community development block grant side, the funds need to be committed at the time that you apply for the resources. That being said, if you've applied and the decision will happen before the next funding round, we do provide an ability to do a contingency so that we don't, because we've seen, particularly with some just normal resources that are paired with the community development block grants, that sometimes you get into a circumstance in which there wouldn't be any conceivable timeline in which you could get one and then get the other because of the requirements are actually,
nobody would want to go first.
Yes, exactly. So in that case, we do provide contingencies that say as long as the funds have been applied for, are likely and will be decided before the next funding round, we allow those applications. We provide as much flexibility as possible, but there are obviously expenditure requirements. So our projects, we like them to be completed in 18 months. We have on occasion had to go for an extension of that timeline. And that extension does have to, as the contracts do, be approved by the governor and council. Up to the full period in which we have to expend the funds from HUD's perspective. So that's who we are sort of administering the funds for. And that's a 24-month period. So that's the longest period that we can extend them for. And we do look, we understand, and this hasn't happened until recently, but has happened recently, that some projects unfortunately have run into additional project costs outside of their control due to COVID. And we were able to make some additional resources available to plug that sort of additional costs, particularly in construction, due to unforeseen circumstances. So like Alan said, we really work with the project sponsor to try to meet the needs of that project and be sure it's successful in terms of timeline and other funding needs.
Great. So I have another one for both of you. Many of our viewers today are SRPC commissioners. So can you talk a little bit about how we, Stratford Regional Planning Commission, either wearing our New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission hat or under our designation as an economic development district, how we can help sort of develop these projects or collaborate with our municipalities to moving them forward, finding the available resources that are actually a good fit for those projects, and how we could, I guess, assist our municipalities with preparing them for your programs.
Who's first?
Alan, it sounds like you're ready to go.
All right. When we provide funding to all of our EDDs every year, and that funding has a couple of purposes. One is to develop and then maintain the comprehensive economic development strategy. And then the remainder of it is really to try to help the organization maintain its capacity. And we ask that our economic development districts be available to assist communities in understanding EDA programs and in trying to get through that kind of convoluted and maybe somewhat bureaucratic process of putting an application together. Some EDDs are better at it than others. Stratford happens to be pretty good at it, as a matter of fact. And it's really about facilitating connections and communications and trying to get a relationship established between the EDA's EDR, which in this case would be me, and the project champions and the leadership of the project, wherever it may happen to be. We don't expect EDDs to be EDA experts, but we do expect that they have some familiarity with our programs and what we can do and what we cannot, to kind of make that introduction, so to speak.
Katie, what about you? Any thoughts on how we can assist some of your other applicants with your programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So our the intent of our funding is to support community-based projects, community economic development projects. They really advance in terms of the community development block grants, the needs of low and moderate income people. So we really look for communities to identify through conversation with nonprofit partners in their community, citizens in their community. We hear a lot of these needs being expressed by the welfare department, really identifying what those needs assessments are, and then really thinking through creative solutions to meeting those needs. And we really see you as our partners in those creative solutions, using our resources for planning grants, where you may understand based on data and conversations with a community that there's a certain need, And there's a couple of solutions that that community wants to better understand and to identify a stack of funding for. And we really look to the Planning Commission to be a facilitator of those planning grants, helping the community who often only applies for these grants on an irregular basis, understand the process of applying and then to receiving those applications. So we really see you as a facilitator of conversations of where those needs are and what solutions there might be in terms of projects that would help to bring about positive change, whether it's revitalizing a small downtown area or extending a municipal water connection to a manufactured housing cooperative, or facilitating housing rehab resources to a neighborhood in a particular community that's very dilapidated. It really starts from identifying those needs, and then your sort of ability to connect what you're hearing as needs and some of that vision for what the solutions might be to our planning grant and or implementation resources. So we really rely on you as being that facilitator of applications, and well, first conversations and then applications that will allow these projects to move forward.
Yeah, so I guess, I haven't seen any other questions come in. So I have one last one that I think is probably a good one to end on.
James.
Oh yeah, Dave.
Go ahead with yours, but I didn't put a question in the chat, but I do want to ask one question before we close off.
Oh no, have at it.
Okay, well, so Katie, if I can understand this, it sounds like for a lot of smaller communities who they already know an awful lot about their financial ability. They can be very aware of their ability to reach a 50% match or not. It sounds like the process, even though they might want to be seeking federal funding through EDA, they really need to start more locally with, say, an SRPC, something like that, and yourself to start putting themselves into a position where they can even reasonably have some success at the EDA, as opposed to starting in that direction where it seems like an awful lot of culling might occur if you start from that opposite end of things, because the 50% match is a hard stop, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We see projects kind of start at all with various funding resources. And I don't think it has to be this way. But I do think that if there hasn't been a history of applying and successfully receiving grant funds, particularly federal resources, it can be helpful for that community to start with a smaller sort of with a project that builds their ability to apply for larger resources. So in that case, either a planning grant, if the project is aligned with the goals of the community development block grants, or working with a nonprofit in that community to apply for the tax credits. And then using that opportunity to kind of grow the muscles of how to apply and implement these complex resources, to kind of scale to an EDA request, which might be a larger request for funds for a more complex project. Sometimes though, the community development block grants are actually a part of an EDA project. So just to say, it's not always that way, but I do think particularly for communities that maybe have not applied for funds in some time, it does make sense to really start with that needs kind of understanding, working with different organizations that are already working in those areas in your community, and then applying for a planning grant or the tax credits as a first step.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
We had one come in, but it's more directed towards Chris's perspective and the CIP side. And Chris unfortunately had to duck out. So we might need to follow up with him and see if we can get an answer after the meeting regarding that one. The question that I was going to ask, so it feels like we're in a somewhat unusual situation in terms of the sheer volume of funding and resources that are available. First, we had the CARES Act, now we have ARPA. And also in my time at SRPC, I've sort of noticed that when we solicit projects for our priority lists and we go out to champion these, it seems like there are always, you know, those projects that seem like a great idea, but they never really get to the momentum and forward motion to get to implementation. They sort of stay in that wish list phase in perpetuity, sort of waiting for that one key moment when you know, they can actually get the project done. So what is something that somebody watching could do tomorrow? Could come out of this meeting and start making progress on that one project that's a great idea, but it just needs traction. How could they take that forward and hopefully try and take advantage of some of these opportunities? Katie, you want to
Me
take
again,
that one
James?
first? Alan,
Oh.
sure, go ahead if you're ready.
Okay. Sorry, Katie, I didn't mean to cut you off. To me, the first thing to do is to go into eda.gov and sign up for the email alerts so that you get notified when our ARPA funding opportunities are published. And read them, find out if there's funding in any of that would apply to your community and to your project. And then another thing you can do is go into grants.gov, which is the federal grants portal for pretty much every agency. And the catalog of federal domestic assistance for our public works program is 11.300. And if you do a search for that in the search box, it'll come up with the funding opportunity and the actual application package for that program, and also for our economic adjustment program. So you can go look at that. You can download the funding opportunity and become familiar with the programs and see if they fit. And if you think there's a fit, then we can get on the phone and we'll include James and discuss it.
Katie, what about you? Immediate action items somebody can do to help move that one project forward?
Yeah, I think you really spoke to it, which is that one project. What I see often is that communities, rightfully so, but have a real list of projects that they're looking to advance. And as you try to push a big box forward, it sometimes can be harder to identify a pathway for success for achieving that project. And so I think what communities could do is really to identify that one project that has the most elements of support, that's most part of your community vision, and that has support from multiple players, both any businesses in your community, individual leaders. And then I think, yeah, as you said, there's really resources right now to be successful at being able to implement that project. And hopefully, because of those additional resources right now, if that one project is successful, it can build momentum for implementing the next project. In terms of CDFA's Cdbg Resources, we have $25,000 planning grants that are available on a rolling basis. And James, you know a lot about those and how to help communities to apply. So definitely suggest that as a first step. Usually it takes 30 days or so to sort of get the application together and go through the public hearing process in the local municipality. But we do commit then to getting a funding decision once we receive it. Once we receive a completed application, to take no more than 30 days to make that decision on funding. So, you know, within 60 days, you could have $25,000 to advance your planning study. And that would align very well to our next funding round. We do have one at the end of July, but if you're not started your application yet, it probably is unlikely that your project would be able to be considered for funding in that round. But we will have one with applications due on January 24th. So if you have an idea, if you can get specific about what you want to have happen first in your community, and then apply for a planning grant, then likely you'll be able to carry out a good amount of that planning activity before that January application and apply for those implementation dollars at the end of January. And if your project is likely to be sponsored by a nonprofit, who's often a subrecipient in these community development block grant projects, then they could also apply in March for our tax credits to supplement the funding needs that they come into for the January round. So that's what I would suggest. We also have, we do a lot of pre-application technical assistance. So anybody who wants to say, is this project we have in mind aligned with your resources? What do we do next? At the top of our website, which is, I'll put in the chat, we have a request a meeting. And you can just request a meeting, fill out a bit about the project that you're looking to advance, request a meeting with our staff, and we'll talk to you about the next steps for your project and what funding you would be eligible for at CDFA.
Great. We did get one more in, and it's a good one, so I think that may take us right up until the end of our time. And the question is directed to you, Alan, but I think Katie probably has some of her own experience with projects like this as well. Are regional projects eligible for EDA funds? And I guess that could apply to either a regional organization or multiple municipalities collaborating, for example, if they were making water or sewer improvements along a commercial corridor that went through several towns. Are there ways that they can structure that, share a match? Have you seen any good examples of something like that?
Yeah, the short answer regarding if regional projects are possible is yes. And I apologize, my dogs may weigh in on because they think it's time to go for a walk, and it actually is. But yes, we can have regional projects, multi-community projects, and we have seen them in the past. You know, a water or sewer line or some other infrastructure is certainly not unusual to cross town lines. The kind of the bottom line on that is that whoever owns the property, the infrastructure, needs to be an EDA applicant. So we can have multiple applicants and therefore multiple recipients, but one applicant has to be the lead, and that will be the entity that we work with. And that lead applicant is responsible for coordinating with all of the other co-applicants. Typically, only having one co-applicant is not unusual and easy to handle. If there's more than one co-applicant, it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's something that we can do.
Great. Katie, what about your programs?
Yeah, we can absolutely have regional projects. So if the projects, if they connect to each other, but they're unique to those municipalities, then you could apply separately, receive 2 awards, and then have them be part of a larger project. The challenge would be that for water and sewer projects, they do have to either be expanding economic opportunities, so where they're going to create jobs, or they have to be serving low and moderate income communities or areas. So often the water and sewer projects that we're involved in are specific to an area that serves low and moderate income residents. So I'm not sure if I could think of a region in which there's multiple communities with low and moderate income areas that are concurrent in which they could apply for a fund. So that's the only caveat. I guess I would say we do have CDBG funds that are put into water and sewer, and they're considered economic development awards because the water and sewer infrastructure leads to economic development. You do have to have that business identified who will expand jobs in an area because of this additional water and sewer, or relocate to the area due to it. And if you had that, then you could actually expand across multiple communities, and each community could apply for up to $500,000. But you would need one job for every $20,000 of request. So in this case, if you were going to do a multi-community commercial quarter, which would advance jobs, say you want to request two concurrent municipalities want to request $500,000 each, you'd have to have a company or companies who are willing to commit to 50 jobs in that case. So it's a little complicated to do regional water and sewer projects with CDBG, just because of the primary focus of CDBG being on low and moderate income people.
Yeah, and I think some of it may also be thinking about who your potential partners are out there, because I know we've talked about a few projects where maybe one municipality isn't the best entity to be the applicant and the partner for that nonprofit. Maybe the county may actually be a more appropriate entity. So it sort of depends on what the project is and how the best way and who makes sense to be part of that team, I guess. All right, I'm looking at the Q&A and it looks like we've checked off just about everything that wasn't specific to Chris. So Jen, Dave, were either of you planning to say any final words or leave us with closing remarks?
I'm going to say, I just thank the Alan, Katie, and Chris for their presentations. They were fantastic. I think everyone dovetailed together really nicely in their explanations. And James, your coordination was great. Thank you. Good job. And thank you everybody else for attending. I think this has been very interesting. Jen, if you want to add to that.
I was just going to say the exact same thing. Thank you to everyone. It was really wonderful. And we are looking forward to doing this in person next year.
There we go.
And we will forward those questions along to Chris. I touched base with him as he had to leave a little bit early. So we'll have a record of those, and we will forward those along. So with that, thank you for everyone for attending today. And we'll double check with all the panelists, but we plan to post this on our YouTube account for those that weren't able to make the meeting.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.